That means we're live.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome and happy 4th of July. What a, I'm really looking forward to today's show, particularly given that we're doing it on the 4th of July. So welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a great 4th of July weekend. And it's a real pleasure, as always, to have Brad Thompson on the show, a good friend and a co-author and an intellectual ally and fighter for the cause. So thanks for joining me, Brad.
Hey, Ron. Yeah, great to be with you and your audience.
And of course, two immigrants to this great country. And I'd say two of the premier defenders of the principles on which this country is based, if I can say so. And yeah, sometimes it takes immigrants to remind you Americans of what this country is all about. So Brad, of course, is originally from Canada, but now in South Carolina, a professor at Clemson University, and of course the executive director of the Clemson Institute for Capitalism. And importantly, we talked about this last time Brad was on, the author of a new book, America's Revolutionary Mind, A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it, and really a book about my favorite political document in all of time, which is the Declaration of Independence. So, all right, and Brad's had a busy weekend. I mean, it's only just started. It's a busy weekend. 3 articles published this weekend. The first one was in Real Clear Politics, which was about one of the chapters in the book, right? The meaning of equality. What does it mean in the Declaration of Independence when the founders say? So maybe summarize quickly the article, and then we'll go to each one of them.
Sure. So the article was on equality in the Declaration of Independence, and as you and your audience know, the second paragraph of the Declaration begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And I think these are both the most eloquent and the most powerful words in the American lexicon, and they really define who and what we are as a people. It claims equality as a truth. And so the question is, what does equality mean in the American context? Well, obviously, it does not mean what is meant by it today. It does not mean, is not equated with egalitarianism. It doesn't mean that all human beings, all individuals should be made equal by the government, equal with regard to food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. It does not mean that. It does not mean sameness, right? So modern radical egalitarianism today means sameness. It means equality means to make everybody the same in all respects. By contrast, America's founding fathers believed that equality was a fact, right? It was a metaphysical fact about what human beings are. What it means, it's what I call species equality. All individuals as humans have certain defining qualities and characteristics, which are reason and free will. And by virtue of having reason and free will, we are not dogs or horses, right? So we are equal in the sense that we all have those same capacities, although obviously we have them in different ways and in different degrees. So equality is one, a metaphysical fact, but it's also a kind of moral aspiration. And the moral aspiration of equality is that we are if we have these same qualities, reason and free will, the one thing that we all need qua human beings is we need freedom. We need freedom in order to live our life, to fill out our lives. And so in the end, equality is really, it means equal freedom. It means equal rights. That's what equality means in the American context. But what I do in the article, though, is I also say that Americans also have this love affair with, oddly enough, ironically enough, with inequality, by which I mean ordinary everyday Americans recognize that they recognize an inequality of talents and abilities, right? We are, in a sense, a kind of a hero worshiping people. Americans look up to individuals who have talent and ability. So while it's true that we have a kind of qualitative equality, by which I mean these attributes of human nature, we don't have quantitative equality, right? There are measurable differences. Some are smarter, taller, faster, stronger. They have a variety of different talents, abilities, and virtues. And so what's unique about America is that we harmonize both equality and inequality without sacrificing either one, or at least that's the ideal.
And it's the equality of rights, the equality of liberty and freedom. That makes possible, it allows individuals to manifest their abilities, to express their abilities. I mean, where else in the world would you have somebody with the, let's say, athletic skills of LeBron James be able to express them in such a way that he becomes a superstar? Because there is something, the sports has become such a big deal in America and the world. It is that freedom that makes it possible for every one of us to express ourselves in the best way we choose, and that expresses itself ultimately in inequality of outcome.
Yeah. So here's another way to think about it. Equality, by which we mean equal freedom or equal rights, is the foundation for inequality. Yep. Right. So what's unique about America?
For good inequality, because aristocrats were unequal too. Yes. But that we'd say is an inequality based on, the metaphysical, the rejection of metaphysical equality.
Yeah. So the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in particular, recognized that there is a distinction between what they called, on the one hand, artificial aristocracy, which was the aristocracy of old Europe, an aristocracy based on government-created inequality, versus what they called the natural aristocracy. And they were advocates of the natural aristocracy, obviously. And I would say that American culture for 250 plus years, and it really goes back in a sense even before the Declaration of Independence, we are a people who we want to unleash and we want to recognize and praise the natural aristocracy of talent and virtue.
Yeah, I hate calling it aristocracy, but I agree with the underlying point, because it's like Ayn Rand rejected meritocracy. It's the ocracy, right? It's a system based on, and that's what you want to reject, not the features of merit and the features of ability.
Well, but you want to reject it in part because you're not quite as American as I am.
No, I want to reject it because you have that Canadian Europeanism, which still admires aristocracy. I hate all those titles. I hate the monarchy. I mean, I find the monarchy unbelievably oppressive. I'm surprised that Ayn Rand said a few positive things about monarchs and aristocrats, and I'd like to see them all crumble. So the bigger, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say as a quick aside that I definitely have more admiration for Queen Elizabeth than I ever did for, say, Tony Blair.
Yeah, I don't admire Elizabeth at all. I mean, when I watched when I watched that series. What's the series called? Did you see that on Netflix?
Yeah. Elizabeth?
No, it wasn't called Elizabeth. It was called The Queen or something like that, right?
Yeah, I know the series.
Yeah, I just, I don't know. It really grated on me. I mean, here was a woman, obviously, with some talents and something, and the whole basis of being queen is altruism. The whole basis of being queen is negation of self for the sake of this great, the kingdom or whatever it is. I just found it so oppressive. And the whole mannerisms, the polite, all the little thing to make a queen. It's like, stop. I'm Israeli, wear some sandals and kick some butt. Anyway.
Well, I'm Canadian, and as a member of the Commonwealth,
There you go.
I do have an appreciation for forms and formalities in a way that Israelis do not.
One of the many differences between Brad and I, which we enjoy debating and arguing about. It's all good. So the second piece, which was I think a huge coup, because this is something that probably millions of people actually read. This is a section in the Wall Street Journal every weekend on Saturday that is devoted to an interview with a prominent intellectual, somebody prominent in the culture. And this weekend, the weekend edition, it's Jason Willick interviews Brad and then kind of summarizes the interview. So it's not a verbatim interview on abolition and the American founding with the subtitle of "Today's Leftists Denounce the Declaration and Constitution as Pro-Slavery. It's Not a New Argument," political scientist C. Bradley Thompson says. So just maybe summarize what this is about. Maybe we'll get to our topic today as well, but go ahead.
Yeah, so
related.
Yeah, well, let me actually share with your audience the process by which this thing was published. So they interviewed me for almost 3 hours. So Jason Willick, the editorial writer, he called me. We Skyped twice, actually, over 2 days, totaling almost 3 hours. And in 3 hours, I said a lot.
Yeah.
But most of what I talked about was about my book,
Yep.
America's Revolutionary Mind, and the American Revolution. That was probably 3/4 of everything I said, if not more than 3/4. And we talked about a few other things. But interestingly, as you said, it's not a verbatim record of the interview. The editorialist, he has lots of artistic license to essentially craft an essay. So he's crafting an essay based on what I said. So it was interesting because in the end, he had a huge amount of material, which he has to condense into about 1,000 words. And so he gets to choose what I say. And it was interesting because, only a small part of the published interview was actually on my book or on the revolution. I'd say almost half of it was on stuff that I probably talked about for 2 minutes.
Yep.
But to his credit, I mean, the reason why I like this essay a lot, or this interview a lot, is because he identifies a particular theme based on what I was saying about the revolution, and then he strings that theme through time. That is, he takes the foundation of what I said about the revolution and the American founding fathers, and then he takes it up through the Civil War and into the 20th century, and really to today. And I think many of the commenters now, there are 300 or 400 people who have commented on the article at the Wall Street Journal website. They have almost uniformly seen this interview as about today, about the issues of today.
Yep.
Which I think was probably Jason's intent. So what was?
By the way, 438 commenters. I'm just looking at it now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going up every
That's great.
30 minutes or so. So during the interview, he really focused on a part of the book where I try to argue that maybe what's most distinctive about America's founding fathers relative to today is that they actually believed in the concept truth that is absolute, certain, permanent, universal. Yep. Versus today, of course, where it's said that we live in a post-truth society. And I think that is, at the deepest philosophic level, that's the fundamental distinction between the 18th century and now the 21st century. And then, of course, out of that concept of truth comes, I think, the most important philosophic, moral, political concept of the revolutionary period, which is the idea of rights. And so he focused on, during the interview and then in his published piece, on how the Americans transformed the idea of rights. Mm-hmm. So in 1765, the Americans were good Englishmen living in the New World, and they thought that the British Constitution was the best constitution in the history of the world, and they were devotees of what was called the rights of Englishmen. Mm-hmm. But the rights of Englishmen are the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. Right? But then the British Parliament passes the Stamp Act and then the Declaratory Act within a year, 1765-66. And the Americans realized that this older notion of the rights of Englishmen was an inadequate foundation on which to argue against the Stamp Act and the imposition of what would come to be what I call the British deep state in America. So they very quickly identified this idea, which they got almost entirely from John Locke, of natural rights, or as it says in the Declaration, unalienable rights, rights that are not given to you by government and cannot be taken away from you by government. They are natural. That is, they grow out of human nature, right? And that understanding of rights then provides the granite-like, rock-solid moral foundation then for the constitutions that would be created in the revolutionary period. So that's how he begins the article. And then the big question, of course, is if the Americans actually believe in equality and rights, how can they have slavery? So I think the article talks a little bit about that. I certainly talked about it a lot during the interview, how America's founding fathers dealt with the issue of slavery, which obviously was not perfect, but given the context of the time, given the limitations that they were confronted with, they did what they thought they could. But it was always the case that all of America's revolutionary founders believed that slavery was immoral. There was no founding father at all during this period who thought slavery was what they would later call in the 1830s and 40s a positive good. In fact, it was considered to be a necessary evil, with the emphasis on evil. Yep. Right. So, but of course, this is the great political moral contradiction that was built into the American founding, and which then quite, I guess, quite, you could say naturally, it had to play itself out in American political life, right? Which it did. And it played itself out tragically, beginning in the 1830s with the rise of the abolitionist movement, up until culminating in the Civil War and then the Emancipation Proclamation. And the article focuses on Frederick Douglass, the great Black abolitionist. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, Frederick Douglass was genuinely pro-American. And he believed that the Constitution, unlike other abolitionists, was actually an anti-slavery document. And so Jason Willock, the Wall Street Journal writer, he traces then my views of the American founding up through the Civil War. And I've got another book on the anti-slavery movement. And so we talked about how Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass represent, in a sense, you might say, a refounding of the United States, or correcting and reforming the errors that were built into the original founding. And then finally, he brings it up into the 20th century. And I make the case that, ironically enough, progressive liberalism of the 20th and now the 21st centuries draws a certain philosophic inspiration from, oddly, ironically enough, the first great critics of the Declaration of Independence, namely pro-slavery Southerners.
Yep.
So they take the philosophic foundations that were first laid out by the pro-slavery Southerners, namely they reject the concept truth, and then they reject the concept of individual rights, and then building off that, then of course they reject the idea of laissez-faire government and market economies. Mm-hmm. And 20th and 21st century liberalism, progressivism, in certain ways has not changed that much over the course of the last 100 years. It's just become more radicalized, and it's shifted away from economic socialism to what we might call cultural Marxism.
So yeah, I mean, he manages to, and you manage to get a lot in a relatively short space. Although for the Wall Street Journal, it is a major piece, and it's much longer than a standard kind of editorial. And then today you've got a piece in the American Conservative. So this is all within the last 2 days, right? These 3 articles. Excuse me. And today there's an American Conservative, which is a piece about what exactly was the spirit of 76, and appropriately, it is published on the 4th of July today, and it's a much more positive, uplifting article about what the essential characteristic of the founding are. So if you want to say a few words about that, and then we'll jump into our main topic.
Can I say more than a few words?
Yeah, well, you can say. I mean, since when have I stopped you?
Yeah. So the second piece, or the second op-ed that I wrote, is on what I call the American spirit of liberty, which I think is following Edmund Burke, who also thought that the American spirit of liberty was the defining quality or characteristic of American life and culture. And the way I get to this question of what the spirit of American liberty is I begin with the first sentence of the Declaration, which says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, what's the single most important word in that first sentence? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. You want to take a guess, Yaron?
No, I'm going to leave it to you.
The key word, the most interesting word for sure, is necessary. Mm-hmm. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary. Well, the question is why? Why is it necessary? Necessary implies that it must be in some way.
Yep.
And so what I'm trying to do in uncovering the spirit of American liberty is to unite theory and practice. So the Americans held these moral ideals, which are summed up in the second paragraph. When, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, that they have inalienable rights. Well, it's one thing, as we all know, as every member of your audience knows, it's one thing to hold certain ideas or principles in theory, but it's a completely different thing to actually put those principles into practice. And all of us experience this. We see it almost every day in our lives. We see it every time we turn on the TV and watch the nightly news, and we watch how pathetic Republican politicians are in enacting the virtues and principles they claim to stand for. So why was it necessary? Why did they think it was necessary? Well, it was necessary because if you hold certain ideas to be true, and if you understand that in order to live the kind of life you want, then it does become necessary. It's a moral necessity that you put those ideas into practice in order to achieve your highest goals. You can view it in the form of a conditional imperative, and if given, then conditional imperative. If you believe in certain principles, or if you want to live in a free society, given the fact of British tyranny in the 1760s and 1770s, then you must live out those principles in practice, which means in the context of American revolutionaries, you have to dedicate your lives, your fortunes, and your sacred honor to the cause of your own freedom and self-government.
Yep.
Right? So anyway, that's the premise. That's the premise. And what I argue is that this spirit of American liberty has sort of been born and bred into the, you're probably not going to like this phrase, into the sort of the moral and political DNA of the American people. It's sort of bred into our culture. And that actually happened long before the revolution, right? Because when you have a people, the British colonists living in America, who have been essentially living free of all political control, certainly from Great Britain, and forming their own indigenous political institutions, then over time, they do develop these indigenous habits of self-government. And that's what the Stamp Act and all the other pieces of British legislation ran up against. It ran up against the spirit of American liberty.
Well, and you know, because as you know, some of those experiments might have been bad experiments, but luckily those experiments were all done during a period called the Enlightenment, where there was a self-correcting mechanism, right, which was both reason and the idea of happiness and the idea of individual happiness. So that by 1776, they were not just self-governing, but they were self-governing in a proper, in a proper sense. They had the right ideas and were eager to fight for those right ideas and to establish those right ideas as the governing principles of the country. And I don't object to the kind of, I don't know what you call the cultural DNA, or because I think it's true. I think it's what makes America unique, is that these ideas were integrated into American society. And I think one of the things we should talk about is to what extent does that cultural DNA still exist? That is it still here? Because I that's the melting pot. To a large extent, the melting pot is not a melting pot of bring all your stuff here and we'll mush it all together and get something else, right? We'll melt it all together. No, we'll form you. We'll take the best of what you can bring over, but basically we're forming you into our image. We're taking our cultural DNA, our spirit of liberty, and you are going to merge into that with that. And and you can see that generation after generation of immigrants have adopted this spirit, not through coercion, not through force, not even, I would argue, through the educational system, but through the ideas embedded in the actions and the attitudes of being an American.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the great things about American culture from the very beginning, from the early 17th century, when the Pilgrims and the Puritans landed in New England, is that there was one great check against their experiments, particularly their experiments in theocracy, and that's called reality, right? So you take the founding of Plymouth and the Pilgrims. Of course, the famous story that we all know is that when they first got there, they tried to implement a kind of primitive communism.
Yep.
Based on the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And of course, it failed, and it failed very quickly, almost immediately. And they went into what were called the starving times. And so that's what I mean by nature or reality. Yep. You smack up against nature, and of course, they made the adjustments. Governor Bradford abolished this kind of primitive communism and implemented private property. And then the same was true of the Puritans 10 years later when they tried to implement a theocracy. And the theocracy that they tried to create in Massachusetts and in Connecticut just simply cut against the grain of human nature, yep. Right? You can't, now they were able to sustain it for longer than the Pilgrims sustained their experiment in communism, but almost from the beginning, this kind of theocracy in New England, it began to wane And by the end of the 17th century, most of the first generation of Puritans, they were pulling their hair out thinking, we are a failure, right? But the second and third generations didn't care because they'd moved on, right? They'd moved west, they'd moved. See, the thing about America is that we always had a geographical frontier. And the frontier means freedom. Because when you're living on the frontier, you're living away from the long arm of government. And that's where these manners and mores, these habits of freedom and self-government developed in the American context. And of course, we had that up until the end of the 19th century. Now, there are other ways to think about frontiers, but the fact is the American people for almost 200 years, from the very beginning of the original settlements in the early 17th century until the early 20th century, the American people were the freest people in the history of the world anywhere.
Yep, absolutely. So what's your assessment of the spirit of liberty in America today?
I would say it's been deeply wounded. It exists, right? I suspect most of the people that we know in our own personal lives are people who have that spirit of liberty and who have it to the same degree and in the same way that 18th and 19th century Americans had it. But what I would say is, if it were the case, let's say in 1750 or in 1840, if 90 to 100% of Americans had this kind of spirit of liberty, what I would say is from the Civil War, the end of the Civil War going forward, that percentage drops, like you drop 1% a year, right? And the great turning point for me, in my view, when this country turned against freedom and a free society was beginning in the 1840s and 50s. And of course, I'm excluding slavery. I'm putting that into a separate category. Was the introduction of government schooling, which started in Massachusetts in the 1840s, and then you didn't have full government schooling nationally in the United States until I think the early 19 teens or 1920, around that point. And of course, once you have government schooling, then what you have is the government determining what should be in the minds of children. And so the government now that in the United States, state and federal, has had 150, 170 years of shaping the minds of American children. And so it's not surprising then. And of course, there are lots of other causes, but the percentage of Americans who have that original spirit of liberty has been declining, obviously, over time. But I would also say it's been accelerating. The speed of the decline has accelerated.
I agree. Yeah.
And particularly just in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yes, I definitely think that's the case. I think since 9/11, the last 20 years or so, we've definitely seen an acceleration in that decline. I think economic problems, just confusion about America's place in the world and what it means to be American. All those issues have come to the forefront, and nobody has an answer to them. And yes, I mean, I might be more pessimistic than you. I don't see the American spirit of liberty in very many places anymore, in very many people anymore. You pointed out that in my debate with Andrew Sullivan, he was making the point of, well, what do you expect kind of Americans? They've lost their jobs. Capitalism has done this to them, that to them. And they're taking drugs. I mean, this is all the consequence of. And I said something like, well, they should get off their butts and go find a job and get in their cars and drive to where the jobs are. And he was shocked by that. He was absolutely, and he's I consider Andrew Sullivan one of the better people out there in the culture, right? Certainly one of the better writers, but also, he's just thoughtful and a good thinker. And yet, to him, he's embraced stagnation. He's embraced the death of the American spirit. and he's an apologizer for the death of the American spirit, and that's tragic and depressing.
Yeah, it is, and it's in many ways what I would just Sullivan in that debate, and then others on what I call the TradCon right, which we can talk about in a few minutes.
Yep.
They have embraced this idea of tradition and stability and community. And the idea here is that America should be made up of small towns where everybody stays forever, and the bonds of communal fraternity are sunk deep into the community, and you stay in the place that you were born for the rest of your life, and your kids stay there, and your grandkids, and it's what they call a front porch republic, right? It's like the Andy Griffith. It's like the Andy Griffith show forever. And as much as I love the Andy Griffith show, that's not what America is about. I mean, there is that element in America, to be sure, and it has its virtues, to be sure. I mean, I live in a place that is like Mayberry from the Andy Griffith show, and it's wonderful. I love living here. But on the other hand, the true American spirit is the spirit of getting up and moving. It's the spirit not of stagnation, because that's what these guys believe in, is stagnation. The American spirit of liberty is a spirit that promotes freedom, and particularly the freedom of movement, right? So you can break free from Mayberry if you want to, and you can move to California.
Well, and that, and progress is made when you break away from Mayberry. I mean, the fact is that I still think that the place in America, at least used to be, I think it's sinking, used to be Silicon Valley. That is the place that exhibited the spirit of America more than anywhere. Productivity, reason, hard work, energy, creativity, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, all the things that built this country, the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that built this country. And I think that's dissipating. And one of the reasons I'm pessimistic these days is even Silicon Valley is sinking together with the rest of California. And that energy that you get when you go to a place that's focused on the future and building things and creating stuff, that's what America, I mean, I can't imagine what America must have felt like in the 19th century in some of these cities in the Midwest or on the frontier. What a dynamic, exciting place to be.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the contrast right there.
Yep.
Energy versus stagnation. And that was always the difference between America and Europe. Europe represented stagnation. America always represented energy. And energy means movement. And so you have now, I mean, this is a sense in which I think the left and the right are converging. They all want stagnation, right? And stagnation is anathema, in my view, to the principles of the philosophy that I call Americanism. Americanism is not about stagnation.
No, and it's anathema to life, which is what makes America great, because America was always consistent with life. Life is movement. Life is change. Life is the pursuit of values, not the sitting on your porch waiting for the values to hit you on the forehead. Life is about constant movement. I mean, Leonard Peikoff has a line in Opa, and I'm paraphrasing it, which is a shame because Leonard always has these incredible, something about when you stop moving, you die. The essence of life is movement, and that's what America always represented: change, movement, dynamism, energy, excitement, and that's what you're missing. Which brings us to this essay you wrote. Was it now a couple of months ago? Seems like a long time ago, but these times of Corona, I can't tell time anymore. But a couple of months ago. So for the American Mind. The American Mind is kind of how would you describe it? It's a publication of the Claremont Review of Books, or the publication of the Claremont Institute in California, which is a conservative institution, really historically dedicated to the founders, kind of religious conservative, but always really focused on the core ideals of America and a respect for the founding principles of the country. And the American Mind is the, I guess, internet hip version, more youth-oriented, more cutting-edge version of that. And you wrote it, and it's got the entertaining, though scary title of The Rise and Fall of the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans. So tell us a little bit how you came to write this, why you wrote it, and then we'll dig deep into the content.
So actually, in certain ways, explaining how and why I came to write it is actually more complicated than the writing of it itself. So I've had a kind of long but distant relationship with the people at the Claremont Institute. I've known a lot of people who worked there and have admired them. The great scholar of the Claremont Institute was a guy named Harry V. Jaffa, who I think is one of the great political theorists of the second half of the 20th century. And so it's an organization that I have some admiration for, not entirely. We disagree on lots of issues. And I noticed over the course of the last year, and not just at Claremont, I mean, you see this now in a lot of conservative and even libertarian organizations and websites. There's clearly been a kind of intellectual churning on the right. And it was, I guess, about a year ago that I came to learn of essentially the rise of what I call an anti-American right. Also, sometimes you can call them the dissident right or the reactionary right, but I don't think they're what's often called the alt-right. I don't think they're that. But what's interesting about this new alternative, or this new dissident right or reactionary right, is their anti-Americanism. And so at the Claremont Institute, through their two major publications, the Claremont Review of Books, which you mentioned, and then the American Mind, I started noticing over the course of the last year that they were publishing essays by two different factions on the reactionary right. The first are what I would call the shorthand, they're the Catholic tradcons, traditionalist conservatives. Mm-hmm. And then the second were, and this in certain ways I think is the much more interesting and fascinating group. It's a group of very young, I mean, sort of like 18 to 35-year-old, mostly young men. The social profile is young men, who they too have turned against the philosophy of Americanism. So the theme of my essay was the anti-Americanism of this new reactionary right. And I would say the philosophic guru of really the ones I call the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans is this pseudonymous author who goes by the name Bronze Age Pervert. And he self-published a book 2 years ago now called Bronze Age Mindset. Self-published, and extraordinarily, it sold tens of thousands of copies. My guess is probably between 50 and 100,000 copies for a self-published book, which is extraordinary. So this is not the right that I had known, and I was just utterly appalled mm-hmm. by their anti-Americanism. So anyway, I wrote this essay. The theme of which, as I've said, was to identify the anti-Americanism of this new reactionary right, and how they share certain philosophic sympathies actually with the progressive left. Most importantly, namely their anti-Americanism. So
well, and maybe even their philosophical core, right? The nihilism. Right. And then the Hegelian, Kantian kind of origins of much of their ideas.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting with the so-called what I call the Baptistas or the Bapsters, yeah. followers of Bronze Age pervert is that in rejecting the principles of the Declaration of Independence, what they have rejected is the concept of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And what they now believe, like the left, like the postmodern left, is that all politics is about power.
Yep.
It's not about principles, certainly not moral principles, and absolutely not moral principles that are true, that are absolutely certain, or absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. All right. They believe in what we can call historicism. The idea of historicism is that there is no permanent universal truth. Truth is just contingent on time and place, and it's connected to power. Truth is determined politically by whomever is in power, which is the position of Thrasymachus in Book 1 of Plato's Republic. It's the idea of might makes right. Right.
And is this the same historicism as was prevalent in Germany
Yes.
in the 19th century?
Yes. Yeah. So it's the same historicism that in the epilogue to my book on the America's Revolutionary Mind, the epilogue is titled, "Has America Lost Its American Mind?"
Yep.
And I compare and contrast pro-slavery thought with 20th century progressive thought. And what I find they share in common is a contempt for the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which means, as I've said several times now in the show, a contempt for the idea of truth as absolute, and a contempt for the idea of individual rights, laissez-faire government, and market economies. Right?
Yep. And how, let me just note, I know some people are asking, in the description of the video below, so in the section that has a little description, there is a link to Brad's article in the American Mind. So if you just click on there, you can get to it. It's pretty easy to find. And there are a bunch of responses. I think there's 7 responses there. And you've told me there are 5 other responses in various websites out there. So people have responded. There'll probably be more responses to come. And then Brad is going to respond to the responders. So this issue is going to be circulating among, I'd say, the conservative thinkers and conservative publications for, my guess is, months to come, if not years to come, because this is a real battle to license for the soul of the right. How influential do you think, and then we'll get into the details of who they are they, and to what extent do you think they are connected to this other new phenomenon on the right, which is, they call themselves conservative nationalists? They've had conferences, they've got new publications, this Cass, Owen Cass as a new, the American, just slipped my mind. But anyway, he's got a publication and website and everything. Are they connected, and to what extent are they influential right now?
I would say they're all living in the same universe, and these new nationalists, the new American nationalists, are the more respectable version, you might say, of these factions. I would say that this new national greatness conservatism, is another way they describe themselves, is probably more closely aligned with what I call the tradcons, the Catholic tradcons.
Yeah, it's Amari. So how about Amari certainly straddles both parts of that.
Yeah, but you can see these nationalist conservatives as somewhere in the middle, ideologically, between these various groups, and they're the much more professional, the much more political organization. So, on the one side, these Catholic tradcons, they are by far the most academically respectable. So most of the intellectual leaders of the Catholic tradcons are well-known, reputable professors. So there is a gentleman at Harvard Law School named Adrian Vermeule, who published an article in the Atlantic magazine a month or 2 ago on what he calls common good constitutionalism. So all of these guys are certainly on the Catholic tradcon right. They're very big into the idea of the common good.
Yes.
Right. And then there's a gentleman named Patrick Deneen, a political philosopher at Notre
Let's
Dame.
talk about that article in the Atlantic for a second. What do they mean by common good? Compare kind of the traditional originalist, textualist approach to constitutionalism versus this common good, without getting into the legalese, but common good constitutionalism, which is not constitutional at all. Right?
Well, it's not only is it not constitutional, it's nothing, right? So if you read this article, which I've read it and I'm writing about it right now, I mean, what is extraordinary to me is that they throw around this notion of the common good as a kind of, fill in the blank, airy-fairy abstraction that has no concrete reality. So in other words, you would expect there to be a definition of what the common good is in an article on common good constitutionalism, but there isn't. There's no definition. And there's no definition that I've seen in any of their writings on the common good. So the common good ultimately then is a subjective term. And the problem with this idea, there are many problems with the idea of the common good, but one of which is that everybody has their view of the common good, right? Everybody thinks, I know what is good for the rest of the country, right? And so every political group has their view of the common good. Every, the 49 flavors of Protestantism each has their own definition of the common good. The Catholic Church has its definition of the common good. Islam has its definition. Buddhism has its definition, and so do Rastafarians.
Yep. Right?
And then every other social ethnic group in America has their definition of the common good. But if there's a common good, there's supposed to be one good that is common to all people and all tribal affiliations. But there isn't.
Yep.
Right? Now, I mean, there is in one sense.
Yes.
Right? And this is, I think, the Founding Fathers' understanding of what the common good is, a term they didn't really use that much. In the Constitution talks about the general welfare. Well, what is the general welfare? The general welfare, which is stated twice in the Constitution, is connected directly to establishing the conditions necessary for a free society. So that means security, by which they meant national defense, and internal policing, and it meant freedom. It meant the protection of rights. That's what the Constitution and the Founding Fathers meant by the general welfare. And to the extent that the general welfare is connected to any political powers in the government, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there is a mention of the general welfare, but it's in the context of the taxing powers, which are then enumerated immediately after. So the general welfare in the Constitution only refers to the specific powers that the government has to raise revenue for the purpose of promoting freedom and security.
Mm-hmm. So just to connect 2 points you made. So the people who get to implement the common good, to determine the common good, are the people who have political power.
Exactly.
It's again, this idea of might is right. That is political. It's all about political power. And his interpretation of the Constitution, there is no Constitution. He believes in the conservatives need to dominate the courts and impose their view of the common good on all of us, using the Constitution as, just like the left has, as reinterpreting it and basically using the courts to, and he says, we need to act like the left, right? He actually says that. He says the left has figured this out a long time ago, that the Constitution is meaningless. The original intention of the Constitution is meaningless. What we need to do is impose our will through it. And that's what he wants conservatives to do, is use the Constitution for the same authoritarian means as the left would have them do it.
That's exactly right. So what the Catholic traditionalist conservatives have discovered, in the same way that the followers of Bronze Age pervert have discovered, is that all politics is power. And this is the key insight of the postmodern left.
Yep.
right? That's what Foucault, that's what Michel Foucault is all about. Politics is power, and so the only question is, how do you get it? And then once you get it, what do you do with it, right? How do you superimpose your will, your vision, your particular vision of the common good on the nation as a whole? So let me give, one could come up with innumerable examples of this, but let me give you one concrete example of how this would work. Mm-hmm. So in Kansas, if evangelical conservatives get control of the state legislature, which then ultimately means the government schools in Kansas, and they require the government schools in Kansas to teach creationism, which they can because they now have the power to do it.
Sure.
And so their vision of the common good, right, is that the schools should include religious doctrine, particularly on the issue of creationism. Well, of course, that means the violation of the rights of let's say, secular liberals.
Sure.
Okay. And then you move to Massachusetts, and in Massachusetts, secular liberals want the children of Catholic conservatives to read Heather Has Two Mommies.
Yep. Right.
So again, it's each side has their vision of what the common good is, and they're going to use the coercive power of the state to force it on everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And what is the and we'll get to BAP in a minute, but what is kind of these Catholic traditionalist, what is their critique of the founding, particularly the Declaration of Independence, more than anything else? How do they connect the Declaration of Independence to the state of the world today?
Right. So we'll start with the state of the world today. So they view the state of the world today as morally bankrupt, and worse than morally bankrupt, totally corrupt, right? So the classic examples that they would look to would be drag queens reading story hour in public libraries, right? So Sohrab Ahmari, who's an editor at the New York Post, that's his go-to example, right? That drag queen story hour is the embodiment of everything that's evil and wrong in the modern world, and that in sum, their position is that 21st century America is a culture of nihilism.
Yep.
Right? And there is some legitimate argument that that's true. Mm-hmm. Now, you can debate on all the particulars of what you think is immoral or corrupt. So they get that part right, that the modern age, you might call the present age in which we live the age of nihilism. That may be true, but here's the problem. They claim that the cause of nihilism is to be found in the principles of the American founding, in the founders' classical liberalism, more particularly in the Declaration of Independence. So their argument is that the Declaration of Independence leads to the Port Huron Statement of the 1960s, which was the famous, for all of your audience under the age of 40, the Port Huron Statement was the classic statement of the New Left in the 1960s, right? And so they would also argue that—
What was the statement?
Sorry?
So what was the statement?
What was what statement?
The statement in the 1960s. What was the essence of this?
Oh, the Port Huron Statement was a manifesto.
Yeah.
It was the manifesto of the New Left, right? And so it was a combination of both old Marxism, we're going to socialize the economy, plus all forms of cultural liberation, sexual liberation most importantly. So the position of, say, Patrick Deneen in his book Why Liberalism Failed is that Thomas Jefferson leads directly to Nancy Pelosi in terms of their moral political views. That the Declaration leads to the Port Huron Statement. That, in other words, all of the nihilism that is in our culture today has its origin in the American founding. Why? Oh, because the founders believed in equality and freedom and individual autonomy, right?
Yeah, more than anything else, it seems that what they really hate is individualism, right?
Correct.
This idea of right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that drives them bonkers.
It is, yeah. So the pursuit of happiness would be the ultimate expression of nihilism, where so they think that the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence opens up an entire world that leads to the liberation of all kinds of desires, and it would be, from their perspective, the absolute lowest desires, right? So again, the pursuit of happiness leads to drag queen story hour. That's the classic example they use. So in other words, what's interesting about this position is that it's remarkably similar to the people of the 1619 Project, right? So the 1619 Project wants to do away with the principles of the American founding because they're unjust in their view. And the Catholic tradcons want to do away with the founders' principles because they lead to nihilism. The bottom line is they reject the principles, both sides. 1619 Project and Catholic tradcons reject the principles of the American founding as immoral.
And they both reject it for the same reason. What both reject is the inherent individualism implied in everything, and objective truth, the idea of two things. Right. Reason as a means to knowing reality of truth, and of individualism, and both have the same solution. Because when you read Deneen and when you read Sohab, the solution is collectivism. Right. It's a different form of collectivism. The left wants a kind of collectivism around race and around and to some extent so do the tradcons, although they would never say it. But they want more of a collectivism around community and around tradition, and which happens to, by the way, correspond with race. The correlation is pretty high, but it both want collectivism, and both want, in a sense, moral subjectivism. Although the Catholics would say it's not subjective because they get it from God, but it's the equivalent, and it's truly stunning how similar the radical left is and the radical right are today.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the intrinsicism of the religionists is really just a form of subjectivism, right? If you cannot ground, look, here's the way to think about it. If you believe in the possibility of talking snakes, Red Seas parting, burning bushes that don't consume themselves talking, virgins giving birth, men walking on water, the dead rising.
You'll believe anything.
What is that?
Yeah.
What is that if not a kind of subjectivism?
Absolutely. And so it's interesting because kind of what I'd call the mainstream progressivism, the mainstream left, if you will, has their wacky, nihilistic, what would you call it, element, right? They have the Antifas, the Black Lives Matters, the so on. And it turns out that so does the collectivistic mainstream, kind of collectivistic right. It has this nihilistic brethren that it kind of distances itself from it, but also embraces at the same time. And this is really where BAP, and somebody's asking on the chat, they say, and I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, Menicius Moberg, is an incredibly influential alt-right blogger on the same level as BAP. Will you take the time to check him out? Well, you have already checked him out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Marburg and BAP and this nihilistic right? Because, Dinan is not nihilistic. I mean, he's wrong and he's dangerous, but it's not nihilism that motivates him. BAP is different.
BAP is different. So I'll begin with Mencius Moldbug, otherwise known as Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin is a high-tech entrepreneur, very successful high-tech entrepreneur who for the last 15 years or so has been writing under the pseudonym of Mencius Moldbug. I mean, so this is public information. I'm not doxing Yaron. He is in effect come out of the closet as Mencius Moldbug. And for a number of years, he ran a very, very popular and influential blog, which I'd never even heard about until really just in the last year. And I'm sorry for your audience, I forget the name of his blog, but he's kind of a strange and curious writer. And I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but I have read what he's written on the American Revolution. So, so here is an American who views himself, or at least did view himself at one time as a conservative, who argues that the worst thing to happen to the modern world was the American Revolution, that the principles of the Declaration of Independence are not true, and that the world would have been much better off if George III and his army had destroyed the Americans. And he instead looks for political inspiration to the Stuart monarchy, the English Stuart monarchy of the 17th century, and I mean and he supports all of the attempt by the British deep state in the 17th and 18th centuries to impose its will on its British colonies in America. So he is certainly anti-revolution, anti-principles of the American founding. I'm not sure I fully understand his positive political vision, but I'm told that he's flirting with monarchy. I mean, if you're a supporter of the Stuart monarchy, which is like the worst form of the British or the English monarchy, I mean, it was absolute monarchy, and so Moldbug has been flirting with that. And let me just say
that he's written that liberty, truth, and justice represent nothing but thuggery, treason, and above all hypocrisy. That the principles of the Declaration of Independence are self-evident lies. Yeah. I mean, it's just stunning stuff.
Yeah,
and he wants an aristocracy. I mean, that's basically what he's fighting for.
Yeah. So I used to know people like Mencius Moldbug, right? And Friday nights I'd go out and have beer with them, and it was kind of fun arguing with these guys. When I was 21. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not 21 anymore. They're not 21 anymore.
Not fun anymore.
And this is serious, right? This is not just college dorm room argumentation for the sake of argumentation. This is real, and as evidence.
Is he influential? Is that reality that he has influence, and how do we know that he has influence?
I'm told that he's very influential. And he was influential before Bronze Age pervert. And so, you and I have talked about this a little bit before. What I have discovered over the course of the last 12 months is that there has been this underground world on sort of in the dark corners of the web, where all of this has been fermenting since around the beginnings, I think probably start around 2005, certainly by 2008. And you have the rise of this dissident right online. They all, and it's a completely different intellectual culture than anything we've been accustomed to, right? It's not about reading books and thinking deep thoughts. It's expressed in memes, right? So this is the world of frog Twitter. This is the world of writing memes and speaking in a kind of internet idiom or dialect, where it's just not clear what's being said if you are what they call a normie, right? If you were to go into their, if you were to go into 4chan, where they used to hang out, and they have this dialect, which is it's barely English, And so they found ways to speak to each other. And let me say, this is important to note. Why did this happen? How did this arise? Well, in large measure, it happened and arose because you had at least one, if not two generations in the last 20, even 30 years, a generation of young people, particularly men, young men, in many ways, teenage boys, who from the time they entered kindergarten until the time they graduated from high school and then college, and now in some cases, PhD programs, if you've been told for 18, 23, 24 years that you are racist, sexist, and homophobic by virtue of being white, male, and cisgendered, and it's everywhere in the culture where every single day you are under some threat of indoctrination and censorship, you can understand why a generation would want to find, you might say, a safe space where they can have conversations with each other and not have to self-censor. That, in many ways, that's how this world arose.
Yep.
Right. So it's interesting, Yaron. When you study this new dissident right, you have to not only study the ideas, but you also have to study the medium by which the ideas are being conveyed, because it's a new medium. And they're using this medium in ways that are, and they are intentionally trying to go offline. They're creating a separate world, right? And
but as you point out, they're also in academia, right? They're also getting PhDs in political philosophy and things like that. So they're not content with staying offline.
Right. So one of the most interesting developments in the last, honestly, it's been in the last year, is through the influence of Bronze Age Pervert. So Bronze Age Pervert 2 years ago published his book, Bronze Age Mindset, self-published on Amazon, which became, in effect, a bestseller. And this book is selling tens of thousands of copies, primarily to young people. And they're reading it on their own outside of school. And the influence of Bronze Age Pervert has gone beyond, you know, the 27-year-old, you know, guy who didn't quite graduate from college, living in mom and dad's basement apartment, stocking shelves part-time at Walmart. It's not that audience so much as what's the most recent development is that there is now an entire generation of PhD graduate students who have turned to Bronze Age Pervert.
And who consider themselves conservatives, who consider themselves on the right.
Yes. I mean, they considered themselves, prior to reading BAP, they considered themselves to be conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and for all I know, objectivists.
Yeah.
And then there's something else that's important to note here. So not only have they felt the oppression of the totalitarian left for much of their lives, but at a certain point, just in recent years, they came to realize that what they call conservatism, Inc. and libertarianism, Inc. failed completely, not only to succeed in fulfilling their political agenda, but more importantly, they completely failed to defend these young men in particular, but young men and women, failed to protect them from the indoctrination and the censorship that one typically sees, for instance, on American college campuses.
Yep.
And so now you've got, this is a relatively new phenomenon just in the last year, I would say, that you have a generation now of PhD grad students.
So Why does Bronze Age use Bronze Age? What is it about the Bronze Age that appeals?
Well, I would say it's two things. It's the rejection. It's the total rejection of Western civilization in a sense.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's a rejection in part of the single most important idea of Western civilization, which is reason.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's being replaced by two things, by what they call vitalism. Right. So vitalism, they're trying to restore a kind of vitalism in a world that has become stale with egalitarianism. I mean, it's a total rejection, which I get completely, of the philosophy of sameness. And it's an attempt to revitalize, at the very least, society. But at the core of this vitalism is the Greek concept, the ancient Greek concept of thumos. And thumos is spiritedness. Mm-hmm. You see it in the character of Thrasymachus in Book 1 of the Republic. And it's thumos is their response. Spiritedness is their response to a desiccated rationality, in their view, right? I mean, their position is basically the Nietzschean position, which is that Western civilization is and has been for a century and a half in a state of decline and fall. And the source of that decline and fall, what could be found in the failure of reason. Mm-hmm. Or
again, the link to German Romantic philosophy, right?
Exactly, right? It's the defeat of reason. And so, you know, they regard normies like you and me as bitter enders who are trying to prop up a desiccated and failing Western civilization. And they want to rebirth Western civilization on the basis of thumos, spiritedness. And so, and the way that in which that manifests itself, right, is they call for first, they are very much into the idea of inequality. Now, not the inequality or the natural aristocracy of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but they want to recognize, in part, it's racial inequality, but it's not just racial, it's ethnic inequality, it's inequality. They recognize all forms of inequalities.
Isn't it they're very materialist in a sense that to them it's about power and strength, and that goes with the weightlifting and with the, you know, it's a rejection of reason, and what do you get instead? Emotion and power. You know, and the Bronze Age is about a sword. I mean, they're big on, you know, like German heroes in German mythology of overcoming all the obstacles, not by using the mind, but by using strength and
so if you go, exactly. So if you go to their web pages or their Twitter feeds, they're very big into posting photographs of half-naked men with ripped bis, tris, abs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is important, Yaron. This is, in certain ways, this may be the most important thing to say about Bronze Age pervert and his followers. And it's this. This is a movement that is, at least for now, first and foremost, an aesthetic movement.
Yeah.
It's about beauty, right?
They say that, yeah.
Well, they say it, but it's which is in part why they have all these visuals of beauty, physical
type of beauty, very much one type of beauty, right? It's male beauty. It's not about art. It's not about, you know, real beauty in art.
I disagree.
No, I think it's more about the beauty in art that the communists and the fascists would have liked, right? It's not about it's not about real aesthetics. It's about a very perverted view of aesthetics, in my view. And this is why the male pictures. It's about art that reflects a certain political agenda. Like the left, they view art as political.
Right. So, well, we can differ a little bit on this point, but I'll take your last point as correct, which is, I mean, if you look at the Twitter feeds, right? So you'll see a string of photographs of half-naked men with, lifting weights, and then the next photograph will be of Saddam Hussein riding a horse with a sword.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say that the aestheticism of this movement absolutely has political implications, right? And it is connected to inequality and power. So Bronze Age Pervert, for instance, has praised pirates, conquistadors, warlords, as sort of the highest and freest type of man. That's why I call them, they're Nietzscheans. They're not strict Nietzscheans, but it's a kind of, it's a reaction against egalitarianism and nihilism. And they want to rebirth great individuals, great men.
But a particular kind, not a Thomas Jefferson, I was even thinking of Thomas Edison, not a Thomas Edison, but right. A great man in terms of military heroes, Achilles type of great men.
Yeah. So BAP says that the fundamental fact of human nature is the struggle for space.
Yep. Zero-sum world.
Right. Struggle for space.
Yep.
It's a kind of Lebensraum, right? It's a kind of, there are limited amounts of space in the world, too many people, and so the primal conflict of human nature, of human life, is this conflict over space. And so therefore the world, in their view, divides between, and this is a concept that comes from the Nazi German legal theorist Carl Schmitt. The world is divided into friends and enemies. That's it. That's the fundamental distinction that grows out of the struggle and the mastery of space. And the ramifications of that, if the world is divided into friends and enemies, and you are in perpetual conflict with your enemies, that means, so it's the elevation of the political.
Yep. And this is the connection to nationalism, right? If space is that important, the nation is important, defending the nation, borders, walls, it becomes hugely important because it's space. It's who controls.
Space is always defined by borders.
Yes. So to what extent does this worry you? That this is where the right, or that these forces are rising in the right? To what extent do you think they can have an impact?
I think they're having a huge impact, right? So, I mean, you've been talking about this now for at least a year on your show, right?
I see the connection with the alt-right because I think they're very similar and they're the same people. They just overlap in different circles. So I've really been talking about this for 6 years, right? I mean, the nature of the new right as it's been evolving, and I think not accidentally in the Trump era, cause and effect is not clear there because I think they feed off of each other, but I think it's a certain evolution. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
They reject, as I've said, they reject traditional conservatism, libertarianism, classical liberalism. Their argument is that is for boomers, right? So the single most common criticism of me after the publication of my essay was that I'm a boomer.
Yep.
And by virtue of being a boomer, I am irrelevant. So nothing I have to say speaks to this younger generation because they're not concerned about truth. They don't believe in the concept of truth. They don't believe in the concept of objective truth, which means objective reality. It's, as I've said, it's all about power. So how serious is this? I think it's very serious. I think it's deadly serious, actually, which is why I've been writing on it. And, Yaron, I think like you, I spent almost my entire adult life fighting the left and taking and risking my career in those fights. But I don't think I've ever been attacked as viciously as I have now by this new dissident right. They've been savage. They've been, since that article appeared, they've been attacking me in ways that I've never been attacked before. But it doesn't matter.
So it's interesting. You've devoted your whole life to attacking the left, except our joint book project, which was which I encouraged you to get into, which was attacking another form of the right, which seems pretty tame as compared to these people, the neocons. I find myself more and more sympathizing with neocons as much as I hate them these days, because at least they attempt to make reasoned arguments. These guys, there's no common language.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
nothing.
But what's ironic, though, Yaron, is that this idea of national greatness, right,
Came from the neocons.
which came from the neocons. It came from David Brooks.
We warned you guys. It's in the book. No, it really is. I mean, if people want to see, because when did we write this? It's a long time now.
2010.
Yeah, 2010. We said this is where the right is heading. It's towards authoritarianism. It's towards fascism. These guys, we said the neocons are not fascists. They are laying the ground for the fascists. And what you're seeing today, I think, with the rise of these conservative nationalists, with the traditional cons, and ultimately with the BAP cons, or whatever you want to call them, is the outcome of Straussians and neocons work for decades. This is what they've been leading towards.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that a lot of these young former neocons, Straussianized neocons, have now become Baptistas. So, but to answer the question, I'm taking it very seriously, and I'm taking it seriously enough that I'm putting myself on the front line and taking an enormous amount of abuse. And I've got better things to do with my life. I got more books to write on the American founding. I'd rather be doing that, but this is important enough that I need to take a little time out of the next book on the founding, and I need to call this out, because I mean, not only am I a scholar, I'm also I'm a citizen. Or at least I'm about to become an American citizen. And so this is important. And it's important for the future, not only my future, but the future of my children and grandchildren. And I think the so-called right has become entirely corrupted by very bad ideas that have to be fought.
And we know that, today, I mean, this is my take at least, that when you get the left as corrupt as it is, and a right that is corrupt as it is, the only way to solve that without our intervention, if you will, is a fusion between the two, which leads to some kind of fascist authoritarian regime. And you can look at Weimar Germany as a good parallel, where all those radical, crazy leftists all became Nazis when it was convenient, or when the authoritarians, and it's not an accident the Nazis used socialist in their name, partially to attract those lefties to come over to their side. And I've said this many times and people hate me for it, but I truly believe that at the end of the day, Americans will reject socialism. There's something about Americans that will not accept the kind of crazy egalitarianism of the left. I'm not as sure that they'll reject these crazies of the right in the same way. And in that sense, I think the future of America is more likely to be authoritarianism of the right than authoritarianism of the left. They feed off of each other, but to me, these guys are more dangerous in the sense, not that they're more popular because they're not as popular, but in the sense that they are what Americans will gravitate towards once the left gains more power.
Well, and I think that is true in part for the following reason, that the left has rejected the idea of nature in toto.
Mhm.
right? And they have gone full totalitarian.
Yep.
This new dissident right, on the other hand, they have, the tradcons have a foot, obviously more than a foot. They have 2 feet in religion and tradition. And of course, that has some tradition. I mean, obviously, America has hundreds of years of tradition in that. So they have something to appeal to.
Yep.
Right? The Baptistas, they are appealing to something that is also in nature.
Yep.
Right? And that thing that is in nature is thumos and vitalism and a recognition that there are natural, measurable inequalities between human beings. But they take these little parts of human nature and they elevate it above that which is most important about human nature and is most necessary for a flourishing life, namely rationality or reason,
Mhm.
and freedom. And they're moving, my own view, and we may disagree on this, is that they're moving, whereas the left is moving towards totalitarianism, the right is now moving towards authoritarianism.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of levels we can analyze this. I mean, Leonard Peikoff makes the point in Dim that the left can't succeed because it's disintegrated. So they're moving towards anarchy. They're moving towards, and you see that in the streets, they're moving towards complete, was a Chaz where everybody does their own thing. And of course that can't survive, even at Chaz. Somebody has to come in. Chaz was this autonomous place in Seattle. Somebody has to come in and be the law and order, right? Because people want law and order. People want integration. And the right is integrated. They integrated around the wrong principle. The principles of religion, the principles of nationalism, and the principles of tradition. But they have some explanatory power. The left provides no explanation. Do whatever you feel like. Just go out there and slam and kill and destroy. And people don't buy that. They want to believe in something, and the right gives them, as bad as it is, something to believe in. And it's interesting that I was thinking about this morning. No Western country has ever really gone communist, right? No Western country has ever, but it's gone fascist, right? And fascism gives them something to believe in. It pretends that it's a continuation of Western civilization. And all of these people do it in the name of Western civilization. And it gives them even the pretense of rights, property rights, you keep owning the businesses, and it gives them all that illusion while, of course, being completely anti-Western. But I wanted to end this segment because we got a lot of questions. So I don't know if you've got another half an hour for questions, but we have a lot of questions. Yeah. I want to end it and to say that I don't think you should view your work as this dichotomized, right? I'm taking time off from this work on the Declaration or on the founding to do this, because what's really happening is you're fighting these people in 2 different ways. One is by making the positive case, which we cannot win without the positive case. That's the lesson to be learned from the failure of traditional conservatism and so-called libertarians. They can't win just by attacking the other side. You can only win by making the positive case and the positive case for the founding, the positive case for individual rights and for reason and truth. And at the same time, but you have to defend, you have to, or attack. You have to do both. So you have to make the positive and the negative cases simultaneously. So thank you for doing both of those. It's crucial at this time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Can I add one other thing?
Yeah, of course.
That is now, it'll be controversial. So, you and I, in our different ways, have been on the front lines for 20, 25, 30 years, fighting the battle. But I have to say, it's also been disappointing to me, particularly in recent times, in the last year, that I'm taking, and I know you in particular are taking fire, not from the enemy, but from our supposed allies who are shooting at our backs.
Yep.
And if they're not shooting at our backs, then they're just going into their little online discussion groups and debating the meaning of what is. So for instance, I'll give you an example. I mean, you've got this happens to you several times a week.
Yeah.
But more recently, as you know, there was a libelous article published on me in the American Conservative magazine.
Yep.
I mean, it was of Whittaker Chambers quality, and it was mostly just sort of, it ended like Wile E. Coyote with a kaboom. I mean, but I will say there were 2 or 3 people who came online in the comment section to defend me, and I don't need defenders.
Yeah.
Believe me, I don't.
But they're not defending you if they go defend. They're defending their life, and they're defending this country. They're defending truth. And that we need, whether it's to defend you or we need people out there defending the good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know in the last couple of weeks you've been emphasizing, the idea that it's Yaron Brook speaking to his audience, saying, Thompson and I, we're boomers. The world is not ours anymore. It's your world. Speaking to your younger audience, it's your world, right? And so it's not good enough to be sitting on the sidelines. It's not good enough to be debating the meaning of what is in your little discussion groups online. There's a battle going on, and it would be nice to have a few allies.
Yep. Absolutely. And they need to start fighting. They need to start fighting. By the way, there's at least one, maybe a few defenders of BAP on my chat right now on YouTube. So they're out there. Yeah.
Nice to see you guys.
Barbarians at the gate, at the gates of YouTube. Yes. And as I've said in the last couple of shows, I'm really encouraging young people to figure out how they want to fight, because it's not clear to me that I know how to fight, right? I've been doing this for 20 years. I can't say we've succeeded, right? We've kept things alive, but I can't say I've succeeded. The world is moving away from where I'd like it to move. And so I'm open to ideas and open to a new generation coming up with ideas and coming up with suggestions and acting. To that, I respect kind of the radicals of left and right. They're acting. They're doing something. They're doing something evil, but they're doing something. And we need good people to start doing something and combating these and standing up to them. All right, we're going to scan we're going to go over these questions. There are a lot of them from all over the place. So we'll just start at the top. Should we pen a new constitution that is explicitly inclusive of all mankind, separate from the historical context of slavery and European dominance that our original constitution was written in?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not even sure what that means.
Yeah,
right?
neither am I. I mean, I do think we need a new constitution, but I don't think the inclusion is an issue, right?
Well, we need an improved constitution.
Oh, so the BAP guy says, just so you know, the BAP guy saying he's putting $20 onto this. It's a super chat contribution to my cause, and he says, by the way, I like everyone here. Yaron's a good guy. So now I'm scared. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Maybe I could start my own show and get $20 questions from the Bapsters.
There you go. Well, not questions, just support, naked support. It's great.
Yeah, so I'm sorry,
a new constitution declaring the equality of all mankind.
Yeah. So I mean, like, I don't even know what that means. I mean, in the context of the world in which we live today, that's an impossibility.
Yep.
Right. I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult, and I mean extraordinarily difficult, to pass an amendment to the Constitution. The amending process to the United States Constitution has a very, very high bar, and that was done intentionally. Mm-hmm. And I think for very good reasons, because you don't want every generation of people rewriting their Constitution. The Founding Fathers created a very good Constitution. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a very good one. Does it have internal contradictions? Yes. Can it be improved? Yes. And so, but I think it would be a terrible idea to scrap the Constitution, right? Can you imagine in the context of 2020 having a new constitutional convention in this country?
It would look like the European Constitution, 422 rights, and it would just be an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah. So do you want Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being a founding mother?
Yeah. And by the way, to his point about equality, it's in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It's very clear that all men are created equal. Now, yes, today they would say men / women / 92 other genders all created equal, but it's clear what that means, right? You know, and it's why a civil war had to be fought ultimately. It's why women got the vote ultimately. It's why all these things happened, because it's not that it's ambiguous. It's just that we've chosen to ignore it.
Well, it is. And look, here's another way to think about it. The problem is not the Constitution.
Yes.
The problem is the culture.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the problem, right? Our government, our politicians are simply a reflection of who we are as a people. This is a constitutional republic after all. And if you don't like your politicians, then you need to get better politicians, right? But the problem is, of course, when the left controls virtually entirely, when they have a monopoly on all of the cultural opinion-forming institutions, it's very difficult to do that, right? But that's where the battle is. The battle is a battle of ideas, and let me say this, and I want to say it very clearly. If it turns out that some of our institutions are corrupt, right? So if you think the social media platforms are corrupt, if you think the universities are corrupt or the government school system are corrupt, instead of complaining about them and trying to get the government to fix them, do what you claim to do best, which is to think entrepreneurially, think outside of the box, and create new institutions. The single most important social revolution of this country in the last 50 years is the homeschooling movement. And no government agency, no Congress of the United States, no president created the homeschooling movement. The homeschooling movement was a bottom-up movement. It's a revolution led by mothers.
Yep.
And that's what needs to happen.
Yep. All right. Do you regard John Galt's speech as potential basis for Second American Revolution? To which aspects of Rand's prose and in what essential context might heroes repair?
That's a big
question. Yeah.
and a hard question to answer. And if I can speak for Yaron, the fact of the matter is, we've been trying to do that for 30 years. And as Yaron,
since Atlas Shrugged, right?
Yeah.
So, and Rand is,
and as you said it just a few minutes ago, it's not like we're winning, right? So, I mean, I think the first thing that has to be done is we need to do a better job of understanding the nature of the world in which we live right now. We have to understand certain cultural and political realities. We have to start on the ground, not starting with abstract ideas and a philosophy in a sense. Of course, that's always in the back of your mind. But the world in 2020 is not the same world of 1957, right? In 2020, we can't even get most Americans to praise the founding fathers, right? There's a possibility that 1 year from today, the Independence Day may be a day of independence from the principles of the American founding. So what we need to do most importantly, is we need to think entrepreneurially and find new ways of spreading old ideas through new cultural, new technological avenues.
Yep.
Which of course is precisely what you've been doing for the last few years, right?
But it's all going to be based, at the end of the day, the answer is yes. I mean, for me at least, and I think for you, that yes, it's going to be based on Galt's speech in the sense that it's going to be based on that philosophy. There will not be a true second American Revolution without a philosophical context. And the philosophical context is Enlightenment. And the person who completes the Enlightenment project is Ayn Rand. So it is Galt's speech that has to be at the foundation, because philosophy has to be at the foundation of whatever it is that is the rebirth of this country whenever that happens. It's just a question now of what are the tactics? How do we get there? How do we get to that? But
I agree.
There's no alternative philosophy out there on which to base America. In a sense, because the founders didn't have it all philosophically, they left enough loopholes for the Germans to come in and wreak the havoc they have on Western civilization that they have. And Ayn Rand closes those loopholes, those holes. And that's, we need to finish the job. All right, we're gonna have to give shorter answers. Recently read Brad's book and the book Hamilton, Chernow's Hamilton. He focuses more on the differences between the founders, the Republicans versus the Federalists. Would love to hear your take on these differences. Oh my God, that's a half-an-hour lecture at least. That's probably a whole semester. It's a whole semester of lectures.
Of course,
yeah.
That's of course.
Okay.
So I'll just say this, that I admire all of America's founding fathers. I think to one degree or another, and in different ways for different reasons. But for me, the constellation of America's founding fathers, from Alexander Hamilton to Jefferson to Ben Franklin and Washington, Adams, Madison in between. I mean, I think they're all heroes, and I agree with some of them more than others on particular issues. I'm not a fan of Hamilton's his view of the national government. I'm not a fan of Thomas Jefferson's views on the French Revolution. And I have problems with the Southern founding fathers on the question of slavery. Sure. Right.
So did everyone, let's see, did everybody remember to do the patriotic duty and subscribe? Okay, that's not a question. The founding fathers were very explicit about establishing a republic, not a democracy. Plato and Aristotle made the same point. How well did the founders know these two philosophers?
So Plato and
Aristotle.
Yeah, Plato and Aristotle. So I would say that the most intellectual of America's founding fathers, they all read Plato. By the way, I know Jefferson and Adams in particular thought Plato was completely nuts, and they don't say it that crudely, but that is basically their position. They just think Plato was completely nuts.
Yep.
What's interesting, and they read Aristotle's Politics. They were familiar with Aristotle's Politics, so I'd say they were much more Aristotelian than Platonic. But the classical philosopher I'd say that they learned the most from was Cicero, the Roman moral political philosopher Cicero. And Cicero is particularly important in forming their views of morality and justice and the good.
But of course, they got their Aristotle through his influence on all the Enlightenment, on the very existence of the Enlightenment. I mean, that's they got it that way. Yeah. Let me just, I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to step out for a second because something's going on here. I need to find out what's going on.
Right.
Let's see. If founders knew slavery was an evil, wouldn't that mean that the founders were evil for knowingly practicing? And then the second question about slavery, could the founders have just started a new country and left the slave states out? I'll be right back. But keep going.
Right. So all of the founding fathers regarded slavery to be a necessary evil. And I think the key word is evil. So in other words, they all knew it was wrong. They morally condemned it as wrong. And that includes Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson says explicitly that the founders, that his generation understood that slavery was wrong because it violated the natural rights of the slaves. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which, right, they viewed it not as necessary as in they want to keep it forever. In fact, I would say that all of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery. The problem is they didn't know how to do it. Right. So it's easy for us from the context of the 21st century to say, oh, slavery is wrong and immoral, and then to condemn the founding fathers because some of them, in fact, owned slaves. So one, we recognize the evil, to be sure. But on the other hand, we have to recognize what I call the post-emancipation problem. And the post-emancipation problem was a real problem, right? How do you I mean, Thomas Jefferson put it this way: we have the wolf by the ears, and we don't know whether to let go or hold on. The great concern of the founding generation was that was the question of a kind of race war, right? How do you prevent a race war, right? And the other thing is, so if you want to free the slaves, so you wake up one day and you say to yourself, all right, I'm going to free 500 slaves who have never been educated, who other than the desire for freedom, have not been educated to succeed in society. So the question is, how do you free slaves in such a way, particularly?
Oh, you could make them your employees. I mean, the ways to do it. But it was a struggle, and they feared civil war, and of course, civil war is what they got. Right?
Well, they feared race. Yeah.
Civil war and a race war and how do you make sure that your neighbors don't enslave the freed slaves, and it's a mess.
Right, it is a mess. And do you compensate slaveholders? Right. So compensation of slaveholders on the one hand is a way that slaveholders would find acceptable, but on the other hand, it's immoral to compensate slaveholders. Yep. Right. So the slaveholders, for the most part, particularly the middling and lower level slaveholders, whose whole whose financial success or their financial viability is built on their investment in slavery, are they just going to one day say, are they going to ruin their lives?
Well, yeah, but this is why, given the split, it had to result in a civil war. There was no, and then the question is, do you want the civil war in the 1780s or do you want it in 1860? But it was going to have to, and then maybe it would have been better if it was in the 780s. I mean, you can rewrite history in your head, but the fact is that it was going to end with violence, and there was no way around it.
Yeah, so let me just add one thing to that.
Yep.
The view of the founding fathers was that slavery was in fact doomed, and that it would die a natural death. And if they had 10, 20, 30 years, it would die a natural death, and that would give them the time to transition out of slavery into a solution that would work for everybody, right? And so, I mean, some of the options they considered were establishing free states for former slaves, right, in the Trans-Appalachian West, or more famously in Liberia and Africa. Yep. But that too is fraught with all kinds of problems.
Sure.
So it's just a very, very difficult question. But lest anybody wonder, I think you only need to read my book on the anti-slavery movement to know what my particular position would have been had I lived in that time, which is that I would have been, of course, a radical abolitionist.
Yep. Do both sides, and I assume here they mean the radical left and right, do both sides believe in U.S. defined by original sin, like at its founding?
Well, I don't know about the historical interpretation. I mean, certainly most religious conservatives, at least Protestant conservatives, believe in the idea of original sin, and that shapes their politics. But there's a sense in which you could say that the radical left also believes in original sin. So if you ask them if they would favor going to a free market society, the answer is always no. Why? Because man is inherently selfish.
Yep.
Right. And if he's inherently selfish as they understand what selfishness is, which is to lie, cheat, and steal, right, as your default position, then no, of course not. You can't you can't have a free society because human nature is such that it will lead to moral chaos.
Well, in a sense, both sides agree on that, right? This is, self-interest will lead to nihilism. That's the individualism needs to lie in nihilism. In a sense, both agree. Do you have any book recommendations on union leagues? I'm interested in the Reconstruction era generally. If you have any general thoughts, thanks for everything. Here's hoping for more guest appearances.
Great question, great topic, and regrettably, I do not. That is an area of American history that is one of my weak spots.
All right, this is from the BAP guy, just so you can see the flavor. What people do in the bedroom is not my business. BS. It does matter what people do in the bedroom. It has profound effects on the nation. In other words, none of this privacy stuff. I mean, there's a sense in which that's true. In the sense in which your attitude towards what you do in the bedroom has profound impact on, it's not disintegrated, but that's, the government should have peepholes into our bedrooms to make sure that what we do in our bedrooms is for the common good. That's a scary thought, right?
Anybody who knows my friendship with Yaron knows that I defer all sex questions to Yaron.
Yeah, and then if you take him to the side, he'll contradict everything I've said. So, could the U.S. currently be defined as fascist based on Mises's definition of government control of private property, of privately owned property?
I mean, we're clearly moving in that direction, and when you're living in the particular moment, it might not seem like that. But if you were to ask Ludwig von Mises 50 years ago, what are the conditions and qualifications for a fascist society, he might tell you that what we have in 2020 is fascism as he defined it in 1950.
It's pretty close. I think the only real difference is, think about what the government is doing right now in terms of its involvement in industry and in our lives and locking us down and then giving us checks to appease us because they locked us down and shutting down our businesses and then writing us checks in order to compensate us. The only difference is we go through a process called election where we pretend like we have a choice and we vote for alternatives as if there's big differences between them. But other than that, yes, very much the economic system we're living under is a fascist economic system. They give us the pretense of making choices, but there's not a lot to choose. Try to opening your hair salon in Texas during the lockdown in Texas, and you get dragged into court and into jail, right? So
yeah, and that's actually an apt comparison. Compare opening a hair salon in Texas to opening a hair salon in Franco's Spain or in Mussolini's Italy. And my guess is that it's harder to open a hair salon today than it was then.
Yeah. Not just because of lockdowns, but because of licensing laws and the regulations and environmental regulations and who you can employ and how much you have to pay them and what kind of benefits you have to give them. No, they're much more sophisticated today. Is objectivism a position of absolute morality or about materialism or both? Was Karl Marx a roundabout objectivist, like I've heard in some quarters?
That's your question.
Yeah, it's definitely about an absolute morality. It's a morality of absolute truth, a morality with universal principles. It has nothing to do with materialism. Objectivism is not a materialistic philosophy and has nothing to do with Karl Marx, who was on every issue, literally every issue, was in diametric opposition to objectivism, maybe in the rejection of religion. But all Karl Marx did is replaced one deity, God, with another deity, call it the proletarian, but based his whole philosophy on very similar emotionalistic and mystical elements. Okay, so this one's a big one. We're not going to answer it, but I will mention it, and then I'll do a show on it. And if Brad wants to join me, he's welcome. Could you comment on the 1619 project the New York Times did and getting it into schools? If you want to say a couple of sentences on it, that's fine. But yeah, this is another one that could be at least a show, but several.
Yeah, so I have a lot to say on the 1619 project. But I think maybe for our purposes, the single most important thing to know about it is this, that it is being introduced into government school systems all over the country. So in Chicago, Buffalo, New York, DC, and in other major metropolises, it has been adopted for the social studies curricula. And that's not a particularly well-known fact. But it's happening, and I will predict that by, let's say, a year from now, it'll be in most schools in the United States. And if that happens, then it is indoctrination based on the big lie.
And it won a Pulitzer Prize. So it's legit. Won a prize. It must be okay, right? It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. All right, this is a perfect last question. And this is to both of us. After commenting on your articles, buying your books, and doing our own bidding to fight for the American spirit philosophically and at the level of policy, how can we best support you and your work? Thanks for the wonderful interview. So, part of my argument, I'll just say this, is stop asking me. Come up with new ideas, because I'm out. Brad?
What I would say is, there is a battle that's been engaged, and get out of your online discussion forums and come out and join us. Come to the front lines, and you don't have to be writing articles or books. But maybe it would be nice just to have a little support in these, when I'm being attacked or Yaron's being attacked publicly. We will defend ourselves, and we can defend ourselves ably. But oftentimes this is a game of numbers, and it's a game of you're trying to persuade public opinion, and public opinion is often moved by the weight, by which I mean the numbers of views that are being expressed publicly.
And this was, to be fair, this was a question asked by Ashley, and Ashley is very supportive of everything we do. So she does all that. And I don't know what to do beyond that. I mean, I think the better you all get at using the resources that we create and that have been created by others, going back to Ayn Rand, going back to the founding fathers, going back to Aristotle, and using social media and the internet to get that out there. You don't all have to become intellectuals. You don't all have to establish your own platforms. You don't all have to, but you have to become activists. You have to become, look at the left. Look at how good the left is at taking ideas from from Marx to the existentialists to the current, race theorists or whatever, and just turning them into slogans and turning them into little memes and turning them into other things and just getting the word out there and using their numbers for that. And of course, BAP and his kind, then it's not like they're original thinkers. It's not like they're inventing anything new. They're taking the work that's been done beforehand and they're leveraging it. They're blowing it up. And that's what I think needs to be done. And the web and the internet and social media give us an amazingly powerful tool to do that. So you can start by sharing this episode, liking it. I only see 65 likes. I know there were at least 400 people, 500 people who listened to the show at some point during this. And right now there are 170 live. Don't run away before you like it. Like the show. It helps in the algorithms. And algorithms are our enemy right now because they're written by people who don't agree with us, so they suppress us. It's things like that you can do, just little things. Go to where Brad has his articles and comment. Go to the Wall Street Journal. A lot of really important, influential people read the comment section. Write a comment, in support, or write a comment that is philosophically in support, whether it's explicitly. Go to all these venues, go to all these articles and share them, like them and share them, like them and share them, like them and share them. There's nothing more powerful than getting the best ideas out there into the world and become our loudspeakers. That's my best idea that I have. Beyond that, we will see what you guys come up with. All right, Brad, I've kept you over 2 hours now. This has been fun, and I think incredibly valuable. And I think we got a lot of viewers, and I think all of this stuff that we do is going to have an influence. Thank you for everything you do. Thanks for the flurry this weekend. That was quite exciting. It was great to watch. And I'm sure I'll see you on the show soon, if not live in Clemson.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Yaron, and thank you for doing everything you do and your friendship. And my last word is to the BAP supporter who's been listening to this show. Send me an email. Let's have a conversation, and I will bring you back to our team.
There you go. All right. There's a challenge to Pax Urania, Urania. Write Brad Thompson an email and have a conversation. All right. Thanks, Brad. Have a great 4th of July. All of you. Happy Independence Day. Let's celebrate the Declaration of Independence. Let's celebrate the revolution that created this country. There's still so much good that is worth living for and celebrating and having, and enjoying. So go out and have a good time. Bye.
Ciao.